Welcome to the debate. The global political order is, well, it's undeniably shifting right now. We are moving decisively away from that brief post-Cold War unipolar moment toward a system defined by multiple, increasingly assertive centers of power. And this transformation is front and center in the material we've been examining, forcing us to revisit a foundational assumption in international relations. Is the bipolar structure of the world inherently more stable, more resistant to major conflict than the emerging multipolar one? My position is that the predictability and the clarity of bipolarity, despite its obvious dangers, offered a more reliable framework for managing systemic risk.
I actually think the simplicity of a bipolar world was the very thing that made it perpetually dangerous. I see why you emphasize clarity, but I come at it from a different way. My position is that the emerging multipolar order, characterized by its sheer complexity, its diffusion of power, and, crucially, its deep economic interdependence, offers a far more resilient and ultimately safer framework than the rigid, high-tension balance that defined the Cold War.
My argument for bipolar stability is grounded in the mechanics of prediction and accountability. When primary international influence is concentrated in just two major states, the U.S. and the USSR being the textbook example, the system is highly predictable. The great scholar Kenneth Waltz, he convinced many of us that the likelihood of major systemic war, meaning a world war that fundamentally reorders the global structure, is inherently lower in bipolarity compared to a multipolar environment. Why? Because it reduces the potential for conflict arising from dangerous miscalculations, specifically those caused by shifting alliances among numerous great powers. During the Cold War, despite the intense ideological rivalry, the system was stabilized by what we call a dynamic equilibrium. Both sides were clear about the other's intentions and capabilities. The clear, mutually recognized deterrence, which, yes, included nuclear weapons, prevented direct confrontation. That structural clarity offers a level of safety that fragmentation simply cannot match.
That framing of the Cold War as a predictable, stable equilibrium it's incredibly clean theoretically, but it overlooks the enormous human cost of that so-called stability. That peace was achieved at the staggering price of perpetual proxy wars fought in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan. And we absolutely cannot forget that we lived under the constant, tangible threat of nuclear annihilation. When we talk about systemic stability, we have to ask whether it was stability built on a knife's edge. Now, let's look at the current reality. Multipolarity distributes power, yes, across the US, China, India, Russia, the EU. This diffusion, rather than being a liability, acts as a resilience factor because risk is diversified. But the key difference today is not just who holds power, but how they interact. The current rivalry, which some are calling Cold War 2.0, features a constraint that was entirely absent in the US-USSR dynamic: massive, deep economic interdependence. We are looking at bilateral trade relationships, specifically between the U.S. and China, valued at over $660 billion annually. This level of economic necessity, it acts as a fundamental, powerful constraint on total conflict. Why would any major power risk total economic collapse for geopolitical gain when their economies are so deeply fused?
I have to push back hard on this idea that rigidity is inherently superior to adaptability. Predictability in a bipolar system often meant enforced ideological alliance. States had no choice but to join NATO or the Warsaw Pact or, risk marginalization. The source material shows that the multipolar environment is allowing states to pursue what we call strategic autonomy. Take India, for example, a major power that is actively balancing strategic alliances with both Russia and the West while upholding its own clear national interests.
This allows for fluid, negotiated relations based on specific, non-zero-sum needs, rather than the zero-sum ideological conflict that defined the 20th century. If stability is the goal, why should we prefer a rigid, zero-sum system over a flexible, adaptive one?
I appreciate the point about strategic autonomy, but that adaptability comes at a tremendous cost in terms of clarity. Rigidity in this context is simply clarity. Clarity in the distribution of threats and responsibility. When power is fragmented,
When actors can choose their allegiance moment by moment, there is a far greater risk of the kind of catastrophic miscalculation that Waltz cautioned against, where a smaller conflict spirals because major powers misread the commitment levels of others. We see this danger manifesting today in what is being termed nexus politics. This isn't just cooperation, it's a functional division of labor, where China handles the economic, technological, and maybe indirect political challenges, while Russia handles the more overt military and geopolitical confrontation, like the conflict in Ukraine.
Can you elaborate on that? I mean, why is that division of labor, this nexus politics, necessarily more dangerous than a focused, singular rivalry?
Certainly. The concern with nexus politics is that it diversifies the conflict across domains, making the threats less manageable and, crucially, less accountable. In the Cold War, if the USSR made a move, the US knew exactly who to hold responsible. Now, if China's funding or materially supporting one aspect of a conflict, while Russia is executing the military action, it creates a dangerous gray area. Which actor is truly deterred? Which red line is paramount? Multipolarity doesn't solve high-stakes tension. It merely masks the coordination between primary rivals and makes their intentions harder to read. It introduces layers of complexity that actively increase the chance of accidental escalation, simply because too many hands are near the wheel.
I think you're defining stability too narrowly, though. You're focusing only on the prevention of large-scale military clashes between great powers. But the diversification of threats itself is a fundamentally stabilizing factor when we consider the full range of global problems. The post-Cold War era ushered in challenges like international terrorism, climate change, sustainable development, global pandemics, issues that are inherently global and transcend the authority of a single state or even two rival blocs. A centralized bipolar system, focused exclusively on military and ideological competition, is structurally incapable of addressing such diffuse, complex challenges effectively. We need multiple centers of power, collaborating and competing, to manage issues that require non-military solutions.
But are those centers of power truly collaborating, or are they simply creating counter-institutions to challenge the established rule-based order?
They are creating a more equitable one. The rise of blocs like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and their efforts to establish alternatives to Western-dominated financial institutions, specifically challenging the IMF and World Bank, signifies a healthy, necessary move toward a more democratic and representative global order. Stability isn't just about managing deterrence, it's about ensuring the underlying political and economic structure is viewed as legitimate by the majority of the world's states. A system where power and voice are distributed, even messily, is a greater and more robust form of systemic stability than one where stability is imposed by two competing ideological giants. It allows for dissent without system collapse.
While the drive for a more equitable order and the existence of deep economic interdependence are new factors, I have to argue they do not guarantee stability when faced with the hard reality of national security interests. The material highlights a serious trend, the erosion of the liberal economic order itself, the very framework that is supposed to be the safety net for your multipolar resilience. We see this through protectionist measures and the recurring threats of trade wars, specifically those pursued under the banner of America First.
That's a valid point about the erosion of norms, sure.
It's more than valid. It's systemic. When the United States, the traditional anchor of the liberal economic system, shifts toward unilateral action and embraces protectionism, it weakens the institutional integrity meant to prevent conflict. If the economic institutions, the WTO, for example, fail under the strain of multipolar competition, where is the ultimate safety net? Furthermore, despite the trade volume, the military competition hasn't slowed down. The continuing strain of the arms race, whether we look at the regional India-Pakistan arms race or the massive nuclear modernization programs being undertaken by the US, Russia, and China, shows that military competition remains a primary driver of insecurity, regardless of how much trade they share. If they truly believed in economic constraints, they would be disarming, not modernizing their deterrence.
I come at the military and economic equation from a completely different direction. The weakening of U.S. hegemonic dominance, which you framed as an erosion, is actually what allows for a more stable, managed transition away from unipolarity. American hegemony, while powerful, also drew substantial global critique for its tendency toward unilateral military interventions, like the Iraq War in 2003, and its occasional disregard for multilateral consensus when it was inconvenient. Removing the single, over-centralized decision-maker actually reduces the risk of large-scale discretionary conflict.
But if the U.S. is abandoning the role of the global rule setter, who steps in to enforce the system?
Enforcement becomes diffused and multilateral. That is the point. I think we need to look at the economic reality first. Scholars like Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye emphasized years ago that the expansion of world markets and globalization fundamentally diminished the state's traditional unitary role, especially in advanced industrial economies. The state-centric, bipolar approach is simply less relevant when capital, information, and supply chains operate globally, often outside strict national control. Multipolarity is merely the political structure adapting, perhaps belatedly, to the deeper, globalized economic reality. The idea that states are the only actors who matter is obsolete.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the nation-state has diminished its role to that extent. I acknowledge the globalization factor, but that brings us right back to the central tension. While markets are global, the ultimate rules are still set by national security interests. Look beneath the surface of the current structure, and the Cold War 2.0 scenario still focuses intensely on achieving hegemonic supremacy between the US and China. While the conflict is different in nature, more focused on technological dominance, AI, supply chains, the underlying zero-sum goal remains the same: dominance and the right to set the global rules of the road.
But the existence of other poles, India, the EU, that dilutes the struggle.
It disguises it. If the core ambition is still for one primary state to surpass the other, leading to that inevitable structural conflict that historical bipolarity suggests, then shifting from two globally supreme superpowers to two primary economic and military competitors within a diffuse environment, well, it only masks the underlying, persistent bipolar tension. The focus remains fundamentally US versus China, with other actors playing secondary, balancing roles. Complexity doesn't eliminate the primary rivalry, it just adds noise around the central destabilizing signal.
To conclude, I maintain that the move towards multipolarity signifies a system where power is truly distributed, making total global conflict far less likely because the risks are too high and the rewards are too fragmented. The rise of strategic autonomy among key global players, coupled with the profound constraints imposed by deep, fused economic ties that did not exist during Cold War 1.0, provide robust stabilizing mechanisms. It is a messy, dynamic, and adaptive framework, but one that is ultimately more resilient than the rigid, ideological, zero-sum system of the 20th century.
While the inherent ideological challenges of the past were certainly profound, the clarity and accountability inherent in a bipolar structure facilitated a specific kind of stable, albeit tense, equilibrium that contained systemic war. Multipolarity, despite its appeal as a more democratic and flexible system, introduces fragmentation, nexus politics, and a complexity that substantially increases the risk of miscalculation. When national security interests ultimately diverge, as they always do, I fear that complexity will rapidly undermine the stability currently offered by economic integration.
We have illuminated the substantive disagreement surrounding a crucial question for the 21st century: whether structural complexity, with all its resilience, or structural clarity, with all its predictability, best safeguards the international order against catastrophic war.
The material clearly shows that the international system is constantly being redefined by these competing forces. It is a process that demands continued, rigorous scrutiny of these evolving power dynamics, regardless of which structural arrangement we ultimately find ourselves navigating.